I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
The evening had slipped its color long before I reached the bridge. Only a faint iron gray lingered above the rooftops, and the spires beyond the college wall appeared less like architecture than the remnants of a half-remembered dream. The stones beneath my shoes were slick with the day's drizzle, their sheen broken by leaves crushed into ochre pulp. I've always walked here when something unnamed presses behind the temples. It was habit or superstition, or the faint hope that Houseman's line about the shadow of a man's delight might take on some hidden precision at the water's edge. The bells of Christ Church tolled as though from another century. Each note trembled in the mist, lost before the next began. Across the river, Merton's windows flared briefly with student laughter, then dimmed. Only the buttery glow of a lamp in the porter's lodge held. I leaned against the railing, fingers stiff with cold, and tried to coax a word into the empty square of my crossword. 6 letters, a clue about shadows. Not shade nor spectre. Something older. My pencil hesitated, then traced a question mark. The scent of wet paper still clung to my coat from the afternoon in the Bodleian. I'd been reading an obituary, not for pleasure, but for the faint curl of unease that sometimes follows an obscure notice in the local paper. Nothing of consequence, or so I told myself. The dead man had been a minor antiquarian, visiting briefly, no fixed address beyond the guest house on High Street. His name surfaced like a blurred photograph in my mind as I watched the slow skein of mist drift across the water. A cyclist passed behind me with the muted hum of rubber on stone. He did not glance at me, yet there was something about his gait, the brief lift of his heel as he braked at the corner, that caught at a thread of thought. I wrote it off, as one does with the trivial. Still, I found myself noting the pattern of his scarf, red and black like a chessboard. A woman's voice carried faintly from the path below. A librarian, if my memory of her silhouette served. Serena Mott, pale as tracing paper, clutching a book to her chest as though the rain might pierce it. She turned into the archway without looking up. I'd spoken with her once about a misshelved folio, nothing more. Yet her presence here, at this hour, felt like an aftertaste of the day's obituary, bitter and thin. I closed the crossword, slid it into my pocket, and watched the tide of evening draw tighter around the city. Somewhere, a door creaked open and shut. Footsteps clicked and were gone. Oxford is a place of small vanishings. The bridge rail was cold enough to leave a film of condensation on my palm. I traced it absent-mindedly, recalling another of Houseman's verses about the land of lost content, and wondered if that was why the clue would not yield. The answer lay in some overlooked inflection, a minor alteration of sense. Even then, before the case had begun, a pai'oatua flicker of deduction stirred, the faintest pulse of a pattern forming beneath the surface. The mist thickened until the opposite bank was a watercolor smear. Only the bells kept their shape. I felt the first thread of a case tightening around me, though I could not yet name it. A scarf glimpsed, a shadow misremembered, a librarian's retreating back. They were nothing, and yet they waited. I turned from the river at last. The street lamps hissed where drizzle met hot metal. Behind me, the spires dissolved entirely, as though the city had drawn a curtain across its own history. In my pocket, the crossword lay unfinished, the 6-letter clue for shadow blank, but for the question mark. Later, when events had unfolded and the room was no longer empty, I would look back on that walk and recognize it for what it was. The quiet overture to a darkness I had yet to enter. The porter had phoned me before breakfast, his voice hesitant, as though speaking into fog. An odd matter at the guest house on Holywell Street, nothing he could quite name, but he would feel easier if I looked. I went alone. The morning was brittle, a pale wash of rain on stone, and the flagstones hissed faintly underfoot. I recall thinking that Oxford's guest houses smell of old carpets and unanswered letters. This one was no exception. The chambermaid met me at the door to the upper corridor. She was small, neat, her hands clasped as if she had just said a prayer. She led me along a passage where the floorboards gave a soft, inward groan beneath our weight. She murmured that the room had been let to a Dr. Fairfax, a gentleman interested in college archives, very polite, always paid on time. She had knocked that morning, received no reply, and used her key. What she found had unsettled her more than she wished to confess. Inside, the air was cool and faintly metallic, as if a window had been left ajar during rain. An armchair lay on its side, one leg splintered. Beside it, a scarf lay coiled and dark with moisture. The bed was turned back, undisturbed. On the desk, a single glass still held a trace of whiskey, no lipstick, no ash. I noted the absence of luggage, the drawer gaping where a small valise might have been. I knelt to touch the scarf. It smelled faintly of damp wool and of something else, a library's dust perhaps. Beneath its folds, a railway ticket stub showed itself, half tucked under the skirting board. Oxford to Banbury, dated the previous day, a small oversight or a deliberate remainder. The chambermaid said softly that she had called the porter, and he had called me. I asked her if anyone else had been on the landing. Only Miss Mott, she said, the young librarian from Merton who came to deliver some papers to the guest. The mention of Serena Mott produced a thin ripple of recognition. I had glimpsed her the night before at the bridge, pale as winter milk. The chambermaid added that the girl had seemed distressed, had whispered that she saw the gentleman's shadow pass the door, though the room lay empty. The way she said it made the claim sound less like hysteria than a warning spoken under compulsion. I walked to the window. From there one could see the tiled roof of the neighboring chapel, black with rain. No balcony, only a narrow ledge and a gutter choked with leaves. A man could not have left that way without leaving his coat or his life. The door had no bolt. The porter had found it unlocked. I asked the chambermaid about the time. She said 7:30, perhaps a little later. I wrote this down, though my pencil paused. In my pocket, the unfinished crossword shifted. The clue for shadow, still unanswered, pressed itself into my thoughts. When she left me, I remained alone in the room. I righted the chair, stared at its splintered leg, and wondered what weight had broken it. A struggle, a stumble, or simply old wood surrendering. On the dressing table, a shaving brush lay damp. The mirror held no sign of condensation, though the air was cool. Small things, easily missed. Serena arrived before I left. She stood in the doorway, her shoulders hunched against the corridor's chill. She spoke in a low, measured voice, almost a confession. She had brought Dr. Fairfax some folios from the college library late last night. She had seen movement in the crack beneath the door as she approached. The shadow of a man's foot, she said, crossing the room. Yet when she knocked and opened the door, it was empty. She had placed the papers on the desk and gone. Her eyes did not quite meet mine. There was something in her tone, a cadence of guilt or fear. I asked if she had noticed anything else. She hesitated, then mentioned a faint smell of damp wool, like a wet scarf. That detail, echoed, made me look again at the floor. A fragment of leaf, crushed and blackened, had lodged in the rug, not from the guest-house garden whose trees had shed weeks ago. I left without speaking further. The corridor closed behind me, its air dense with polish and time. Somewhere below, the porter's bell chimed. Outside, rain began again, threading the stones like silver wire. The image of the empty room lingered, a chair overturned, a damp scarf, and a shadow that should not have been there at all. The library that morning smelt of sleep and stone. Rain streaked the mullioned windows, casting long vertical shadows on the tables like unfinished calligraphy. Lewis and I stepped through the oak doors without speaking. He carried the case file under one arm. I, my notebook, half filled with guesses rather than facts. The vaulted ceiling drew the sound of our footsteps upward until it seemed the books themselves were listening. A librarian with hair the color of cold ash guided us past a display of chained folios toward a recess where Dr. Fairfax had spent his days. She whispered that he had arrived each morning promptly at 9, requested nothing but water and silence, and left at dusk without farewell. His last request had been a sheaf of medieval marginalia from the Benedictine collection, obscure footnotes and glosses no one had studied for decades. She gestured to the stack still on the desk, a pale tower of vellum bound in cracked leather. Lewis stood beside me as I bent over the open folio. Ink faded to brown crawled across the page like roots under frost. Between Latin and Old English, a marginal hand had scribbled a line from Milton, but the wording jarred. Darkness made visible, it read, "Not darkness visible." That single added verb lodged in me like grit. A man who copies from memory rarely invents. He reveals his own reading. Lewis said quietly that the dean was waiting in his rooms, eager to help. I asked what debts a dean might carry at his age. Lewis shrugged. Rumors of misallocated funds, an expensive habit at the Turf Tavern, a brother in trouble. Nothing proved. On the far side of the room, a man pretended to browse a shelf but watched us between the spines. He was the rival scholar, a lean figure in a frayed tweed jacket, known for translating too quickly and footnoting too seldom. I remembered his name from a panel on medieval numerology. His eyes flickered away when I met them. The smell of his pipe clung to the air, though smoking had long been forbidden. Serena arrived last, her umbrella dripping onto the parquet. She carried a slim folder of papers, clasped like a fragile organ. She murmured that she had been asked by the dean to bring additional indices. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled just enough to bend the corner of a page. She avoided looking at the empty desk where Fairfax's notes lay. I lifted one of the folios and found between its leaves a scrap of newer paper. A catalogue slip with a penciled number and a single word. Innocent. Perhaps a book request, perhaps something else. I folded it into my notebook. The crossword from my morning tea still waited there, the clue for shadow unfilled. I began to suspect that the answer was not a noun, but a verb. Lewis asked Serena whether Fairfax had spoken of his research. She hesitated. Only that he believed the footnotes hid a confession by the original scribe, she said. Something about debts unpaid, names concealed. She colored slightly as she spoke. The rival scholar coughed into his fist and moved further down the aisle. I turned a page and noticed a faint smear of damp across the margin, as though someone had traced it with a wet sleeve. Beneath the misquoted Milton, a second hand had written a date. 1634. Nothing remarkable except that the rest of the folio dated from 1629, a later intrusion. Someone had been inserting their own commentary into the past. Lewis muttered that all this medieval nonsense gave him a headache. I said nothing. The smell of paper and rain pressed in like a slow tide. Through the window a student crossed the quad, his coat a red check that echoed the scarf from the guest house. Coincidence, perhaps. Yet my pencil paused. The dean's footsteps approached along, the corridor, measured and soft. He entered with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes and spoke of his devotion to scholarship, of how tragic it was that Fairfax had vanished. His ring left a faint indentation on the table as he leaned over the folio. A heavy signet, engraved with initials I did not recognize. He asked whether we had found any leads. I told him we were still at the footnotes. He laughed softly, as if at a private jest. When he left, the rival scholar followed at a polite distance. Serena remained, staring at the misquoted line. She whispered that she had copied it out the night before for Fairfax, but had not noticed the extra verb. Darkness made visible. Her words trembled. I wrote them down. We walked back into the rain. Lewis said he preferred the smell of bacon to the smell of books. I said nothing again. In my pocket, the crossword pressed its blank square against my thumb. A verb, I thought, not a noun. Something moving unseen. The Randolph's bar had always felt to me like a room built for confidences no one intended to keep. Even at midday, the curtains dimmed the light to a dusky amber, and the polished tables reflected one's face like a muted echo. I sat in my usual corner, a single glass of Saint-Emilion breathing beside the folded police report. The smell of beeswax and old upholstery clung to the air. From the lounge, a thread of Puccini drifted faintly, a tenor's voice turning on some impossible note. I'd been through the report twice already. It listed facts as if by rote. Dr. Fairfax, missing. Room disturbed, but no signs of struggle. Scarf damp. Ticket stub to Banbury. Yet the phrasing snagged. In the chambermaid's account, the time of entry had shifted by 10 minutes between her first and second statement. Not much, but enough to make a lie or a lapse. My pencil hovered above the margin. Beside the report lay a letter, brief and oddly formal. Addressed to Fairfax from an unnamed correspondent, it spoke of debts of honor and shadows at the gate. I read it again and again, searching for a fingerprint of style. The rhythm of the sentences felt rehearsed, as though translated from another tongue or copied from an older text. The word honor carried its U with a faint hesitation of ink, like a man pausing before he signs his name. I lifted the glass, tasted the wine, and tried to imagine Fairfax's last evening. The folios, the footnotes, the misquoted Milton. Darkness made visible. The phrase rolled through my head like a coin. In my notebook the crossword waited. 6 letters, a clue for shadow. I wrote eclipse, then crossed it out. Across the room the receptionist placed a register on the counter for a new guest. I watched without appearing to. A name caught my eye as the book turned. Strode. I knew it from somewhere, though the context eluded me. Not a common visitor's name, it belonged to a donor listed in Merton's archives, a benefactor to the dean's discretionary. My pencil noted it before my mind had shaped the thought. The tenor in the lounge rose to a high phrase that seemed about to break, and then fell back into silence. I found myself thinking of Serena, her voice low, her eyes refusing mine. She had spoken of the shadow as if it were an omen rather than an observation. I remembered how her fingers bent the page's corner, a gesture of someone marking a secret she could not return to. There are women who slip past one's defenses, not by warmth, but by absence. Serena belonged to that order. The waiter approached, murmured a question about another glass. I shook my head. He moved on, leaving the faint scent of lemon polish. I unfolded the letter again. The phrase, shadows at the gate, began to sound less like metaphor than location. The college's side entrance, perhaps, or the old gatehouse near the guest house. Small things one stores without knowing why. I turned the police report back to the witness section. The rival scholar had given an alibi of being in the Bodleian until closing. The dean had been at evensong, but no one had seen him. Serena had been cataloguing alone. Each statement arranged like a neat row of books, but one slightly out of alignment. The register on the counter closed with a soft thud. Strode, I mouthed the name silently. The wine deepened its color as the light faded. Outside, rain tapped at the tall windows with a sound like a slow metronome. I closed the report and sat back. The tenor began again, softer now, the melody like a memory that will not resolve. I thought of Serena's umbrella dripping onto the library floor, of Fairfax's damp scarf, of the misquoted line in the margin. In my mind a pattern stirred but did not yet speak. I drained the last of the glass. The day was turning, and the case with it, though I could not yet see how. The canal path that morning was slick as oiled slate. A slow mist lifted off the water, rolling over the towpath like steam from an old kettle. Lewis waited under a plane tree, one hand jammed into his coat pocket, the other holding a sodden evidence bag. Even at a distance I saw his expression, a mixture of triumph and unease. He said he'd found it wedged behind the railing near the lock, a bicycle with its chain half off and its tires still damp with night dew. The frame was sturdy but old, a kind once issued to undergraduates. Its rear light was cracked, revealing a filament that had long since burned out. Taped to the handlebar was a slip of paper, torn from a diary, the edge scalloped like a broken stamp. I took it from him. The ink had blurred, but the words were still legible enough. The shadow of a man's past walks beside him even when the road is empty. I read it twice, feeling the cadence of a confession rather than a warning. Lewis muttered that it must be Fairfax's. I told him perhaps, though no name was written, and a man who quotes aphorisms seldom leaves them at crime scenes by chance. The canal smelled of algae and diesel from a passing barge. Somewhere, a bell from a riverside chapel marked the hour. I crouched by the bicycle, ran my fingers over the mud on its pedals. The impression of a shoe lingered, narrow and pointed, unlike the porter's broad boots. The deduction was small, but enough to make me doubt our informant before he even spoke. We found the porter waiting on a bench near the bus stop. He was an elderly fellow whose cap seemed 2 sizes too large, the visor shading watery eyes. He said he'd seen a gentleman fitting Fairfax's description climb aboard the Banbury bus just after dawn. I asked about the coat, the scarf, the bag. He hesitated, then added details as though painting from memory rather than observation. Lewis scribbled in his notebook, but I watched the man's hands. They trembled only when he spoke of the ticket inspector, not when he spoke of Fairfax. It occurred to me that the porter had been reading the local paper while waiting, and the photograph of Fairfax, grainy and formal, might have colored his recollection. A bus at dawn, a tall figure boarding. How easily the mind confects a certainty out of fog. I thanked him nonetheless. He nodded, relieved, and pulled his cap lower. We walked back along the towpath. Lewis asked if I believed the man. I said belief was a dangerous indulgence in our trade. He frowned at the bicycle, said it pointed clearly to flight. I replied that a man who flees leaves more than a bicycle and a line of self-pity behind him. My crossword had traveled with me in my coat pocket, folded to the same clue. 6 letters for shadow. I glanced at the diary scrap again. The shadow of a man's past. A verb, not a noun. Something that follows. I wrote haunts in the margin of my mind. The mist thickened, muffling the sound of our steps. We passed under a bridge where moss dripped like green candles. The water below reflected nothing but a pale oval of sky. I thought of Serena at her desk, copying footnotes, unaware perhaps of the bicycle abandoned by the lock. Or aware and silent. Lewis kicked at a stone, sending ripples through a puddle. He said the dean had agreed to another interview. I said good. The rival scholar was nowhere to be found. Good again. The case felt like a tapestry hung backward, threads visible, pattern hidden. We reached the car. I looked back once at the canal, at the bicycle still leaning where we had left it. The diary page lay inside its bag, words pressed faintly against the plastic like breath on glass. The porter's image of Fairfax boarding the bus began already to dissolve in my mind. Some shadows are thrown not by bodies, but by memory. The morning after the canal began with a small square of newsprint and the smell of overbrewed tea. My flat was silent except for the tick of the kitchen clock, a sound that sometimes resembled a dripping tap in a deserted corridor. I unfolded the crossword with a certain dread. It had been waiting since the Audiobook night before, its blank grid a reproach to my stubbornness. 6 across asked for innocent. 7 letters, not guileless, not naive. The setter had left no easy foothold. I sipped the tea, grimaced at its bitterness, and thought of Serena's eyes avoiding mine in the library, of the dean's courteous evasions, of the rival scholar's frayed cuffs. Each had presented an alibi as polished as a tutorial essay. Footnoted, plausible, but somehow hollow. Lewis had brought me the coded poem late the previous evening. He said he'd found it folded in the dean's top drawer beneath a stack of invoices. Written in a cramped hand on the college letterhead, it rhymed with too much effort. Lines about a girl in a cloister, about debts and stolen words. It seemed to point at Serena by name, though only in initials. I read it twice, then a third time, the way one reads a passage whose meaning ought to be clear, but isn't. The poem's neatness irritated me, too symmetrical, like a chess problem left on a table for a stranger to solve. I laid it beside the crossword, the two puzzles glancing off each other like mirrors. Innocent. 7 letters. Outside, rain darkened the stone of the street to a color almost blue. Students passed under umbrellas with their heads bent, murmuring fragments of Latin or gossip. Somewhere, a bell sounded, the quarter hour. The city's rhythm continued, indifferent to a missing antiquarian and an unfinished crossword. I tried candidate answers. Virginal, sinless, blameless. None fit the cross-checking letters. I penciled each in and rubbed it out, the eraser leaving small pink ghosts on the page. My mind returned to the suspects. Pride was their common element, not innocence. The dean protecting his reputation, the rival scholar guarding his translations. Serena perhaps shielding something more fragile, her complicity or her dignity. A slip of paper protruded from the poem, a library slip again, like the one at the bicycle. But this one bore a date from 2 years ago and a call number for a volume on medieval legal oaths. I wondered if Fairfax had traced the same pattern before me. I wondered if someone had planted it for me to find, anticipating my habits the way a setter anticipates a solver's misstep. I turned back to the crossword. The clue's wording was odd. Innocent exposed by pride's rival. That was the entire line. Not a definition, but a riddle. Pride's rival. In Latin, superbia, opposed by humilitas. Humility. Innocent, revealed by humility. 7 letters. I wrote lambent without thinking, then crossed it out. My pencil hovered. The poem's first letters of each line spelled a name when read downward, or almost did. An acrostic that faltered at its third line, substituting one letter for another. A mistake or a hint. The wrong letter gave not Serena, but a different initial. I felt the faintest shift in the puzzle's weight. I poured another cup of tea, colder now. The rain softened outside, its sound like sand poured through fingers. In the silence, I thought of Fairfax hunched over the folios, copying marginalia no one else cared for. The dean with his ring cutting a circle into the library table, the rival scholar coughing into his fist. Serena bending a page's corner, each gesture minor, perhaps meaningless, yet each left an imprint like an ink smudge on a footnote. I returned to the clue. Innocent, exposed by pride's rival. 7 letters. I wrote humble as a joke, then realized lambkin fitted both pattern and cross-check. A sacrificial image, still unsatisfactory. The setter had hidden something more elegant. The coded poem lay between my hands. I saw then that the capital letters at the ends of its lines, not the beginnings, spelled another word. Banbury. Not Serena at all, but a destination. My pencil stopped mid-air. Someone wanted me to look at her, to follow the neat path of suspicion. Another elegant but false solution. The crossword remained unfinished on the table. The poem folded back into its envelope. Outside, the rain eased to a mist that blurred the street lamps. I sat in the dim kitchen, the tick of the clock like a footstep in an empty corridor, and felt the case shifting again. Slowly, like a door opening without a sound. The archives lay beneath the chapel like a cellar of lost intentions. Even the air down there was heavy with something unspoken, a blend of dust and candle soot that clung to the fingers. Lewis and I descended the narrow stair without speaking. Each step echoed as though we were walking inside a filing cabinet. The archivist, a woman with spectacles that magnified her eyes to the size of small coins, unlocked a gate and left us alone among the shelves. She had warned us to replace everything exactly as found. Her tone suggested that books, unlike people, deserved that courtesy. Lewis moved ahead with an ease I envied, pulling boxes at random, flipping through folders. He called softly after a few minutes. There was something we ought to see. He held up a photograph, its edges frayed and yellowing. I took it from him. A group of young scholars stared out of the image, their faces blurred but recognizable in outline. At the back stood Fairfax, not yet grey, his hair a dark wave falling across his brow. Beside him, the rival translator whose cough had echoed in the library, lean and eager even then. Both smiled with the brittle confidence of men who believe in footnotes as in scripture. The photograph's caption named an entirely different committee. An archaeology bursary from the same year, but another discipline. A misfile, perhaps accidental, perhaps deliberate. I slipped it from its sleeve and turned it over. On the reverse, a note in fading ink. Translation Fund, Dean's Discretion, 1983. The handwriting resembled the Dean's letters, a formal hand that looped its F's like little scythes. Lewis said it proved the two had known each other. I nodded. It proved more. The Dean's signature tied them to a grant, now long forgotten, and the translation itself, a medieval charter turned into English too quickly, its authenticity later challenged, had been a quiet scandal at the time. I remembered a footnote in a journal, a curt retraction buried like a body. I returned the photograph to its sleeve, but left it slightly askew, as though a gust had disturbed the order. Something in the misfiling felt purposeful, like a clue left for a reader who might never arrive. My pencil hovered over my notebook. The archive's smell deepened as we moved further in. Glue, foxed paper, the cold sweetness of stone. In one box, I found a program from a lecture given by Fairfax a decade ago on the ethics of translation. He had written in the margin a single word, penance, underlined twice. Lewis asked whether this meant motive. I said motive was a luxury. What mattered was grievance. Two men once allied, later estranged under the eye of a dean who had brokered their funding. The dean's ring-cutting circles into library wood. Serena's tremor when mentioning debts. Threads beginning to braid. We returned to the photograph. I held it at arm's length, squinting at the faces behind the front row. A woman half hidden by the edge of the frame, her hair pinned severely, her gaze on someone beyond the camera. Not Serena, too old, the wrong era. But a likeness enough to flicker, the pattern of resemblance like an echo across time. I noticed also that Fairfax's hand rested on the rival scholar's shoulder, but the fingers curved slightly inward, not in camaraderie, but in restraint, as if holding something back. Small gestures often outlive words. Lewis replaced the box carefully, aligning it with its neighbors. He asked, what next? I said we would speak again to the dean. His name in the photograph's reverse could not be ignored. Yet even as I said it, I knew he would deny, deflect, produce another poem or alibi. We climbed back toward the daylight. The stair smelled of damp stone and old ink. In my pocket, the photograph's image lingered, though we had left it behind. Two younger men smiling at a promise that would sour, a dean in the background like a patron saint of missteps, and a misfiled label waiting decades for someone to read it differently. At the top of the stair, the chapel bells began to toll, their sound reaching us as though through water. I paused, one hand on the railing, and felt the case shift again beneath me. Not a revelation, just the faint click of another piece sliding into its place. Night had taken hold of Oxford with its usual stealth, the streets rinsed clean by an afternoon squall and now glistening like varnished slate. I had arranged to meet Serena outside the library after closing, though she had chosen the bench under the archway rather than the brighter lamps by the gate. Her umbrella lay folded at her feet, wet as a sleeping bird. She began without preamble. There had been a note in her pigeonhole, unsigned, the ink pale as though diluted. "Leave the shadows alone," it said. She whispered it like a charm she had tried to forget. She thought Fairfax had staged everything, she murmured, that he wanted to vanish, to expose some hypocrisy at the college and then slip into legend. Yet her eyes, which had always held a kind of translucent composure, flickered sideways as she spoke. I listened, but my mind moved differently from her words. She was telling me the story she hoped would suffice, but her pauses betrayed her. When she described the handwriting, she said it looked neither male nor female. When she described the paper, she said it smelt faintly of old glue, the sort used in the dean's office on archival envelopes. Small confessions disguised as details. I asked gently if she feared for Fairfax's safety. She hesitated, then said no. She feared for someone else. The sentence hung between us like a damp cord. She drew her coat closer, though the night was not especially cold. Her fingers worried at the edge of the note she had brought me. It was folded into a square so precise it seemed cut rather than creased. The bells of Merton struck 9. Somewhere across the quad a porter locked a door. The sound echoed down the cloisters like the turning of a key in a well. I told Serena I would be watching the library that night, in case whoever sent the note returned. She looked at me with something like pity, then rose, smoothing her skirt with one hand. "Be careful," she said. "It's darker inside than you think." When she had gone, her umbrella forgotten on the bench, I took it as a token and entered the library through the side door. The place at night was a different creature. Rows of spines like closed eyelids, the smell of paper deeper, almost animal. Floorboards creaked with a softness that suggested someone 2 aisles away, though no one was there. I stationed myself near Fairfax's usual desk. The folios still lay stacked like a barricade. The coded poem, the misquoted Milton, the missing man. I left the lamp unlit. Outside, rain began again. Its sound filtered through stained glass. Minutes passed, then an hour. My pencil traced the crossword in my pocket by feel, the square for shadow still blank. I thought of the diary scrap at the Canal, the photograph misfiled, the dean's looping effies. Patterns glimmered and retreated. Once I thought I heard a footstep in the gallery above. I rose, moved silently between the stacks. Nothing but the echo of my own breath. Yet a smell drifted down. Damp wool, unmistakable. The same scent that had clung to the scarf in the empty room. It lingered for a moment, then thinned like smoke. I stood very still, listening. The building offered only its usual nocturnal sounds. Pipes ticking, wood settling, the faint stir of air through the heating grills. Whoever had been there, if anyone had left no trace. I returned to the desk, opened Serena's folded note once more. "Leave the shadows alone." The writing trembled slightly where the pen had lifted, as though the hand that wrote it feared its own message. I wrote in my notebook, "Not Fairfax, protecting someone." When the clock struck 11, I left the library. The quad lay deserted, rain pooling in the worn steps. I set Serena's umbrella against the wall for her to find in the morning. The smell of damp wool still clung faintly to my coat, as if the shadow I had not seen had brushed past me. In my pocket, the crossword pressed its question into my palm, the clue for shadow still unanswered. I walked toward the gate, thinking not of Fairfax now, but of Serena's sidelong glance, the unclaimed umbrella, and the note that warned her away. Some confessions arrive without a crime. Some crimes wait without confession. I remember the rain that evening more than the street lights. It had thinned to a soft drizzle, a film on the panes of my flat, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of copper and ash. I set my coat across the chair, laid my notes on the kitchen table, and poured a measure of whiskey. The bottle gave its small sigh, as though even it were tired of my rituals. The folio copy lay where I had left it. Milton's line stared back at me from the margin, the same phrase that had pursued me through the guest house, the library, the canal. Darkness made visible. For days I'd called it a misquote, a slip of memory or translation. Now, alone with only the clock ticking like a hesitant metronome, I read it once more and saw it differently. It was not a mistake. It was an instruction. I took out the original text from my own shelf. An old edition, its spine cracked from use. In the true line, the poet writes of darkness visible, nothing more. To insert made was to shift the weight of meaning, to transform description into act. Darkness made visible. Something hidden brought to light. A place not metaphorical, but real. I felt the faint click of a piece sliding into place. Fairfax had not been copying Milton badly. He had been signaling, made visible, a location where light penetrated darkness. A stairwell, perhaps, or an archive's blind corner. My pencil moved across the page before I could stop it, drawing an arrow between the altered word and a note I had scribbled days earlier about the old wine cellar beneath the hall. Outside, tires hissed on wet tarmac. Somewhere a church bell gave a muffled chime. I thought of Serena's story, the shadow she swore she had seen crossing an empty room. If a concealed stair opened off that room, the light from below would have cast just such a movement. Not Fairfax, but someone else slipping out unseen. I rose, pacing the narrow strip between table and window. The whiskey's warmth steadied my hand, but sharpened my mind. Each suspect's alibi unfolded in a new light. The dean at evensong, unobserved. The rival scholar in the Bodleian, but only until closing. Serena alone in the stacks. Pride, debts, translation, and now a deliberate signal embedded in a poet's line. I unfolded my crossword. The clue for shadow still lay blank. 6 letters. I wrote double and scratched it out, then figure and scratched again. My pencil hovered. In Latin, umbra carries also the sense of guest, of one invited to a feast. Shadow as companion. The clue was not asking for a shade, but a guide. I wrote escort in the margin and let it sit. Back at the table, I examined my notes from the guest house. The window's ledge, the gutter of leaves, the splintered chair. A concealed stair would account for much, but not all. Yet the altered Milton was too exact to ignore. Fairfax had left breadcrumbs for someone he trusted to follow. Perhaps me, perhaps Serena, perhaps both. I turned the folio page and noticed what I had missed before. A small mark in the corner, not ink, but a smudge of something pale, like chalk. In the college's cellars, the walls were coated with lime wash. The connection was slender, but it caught. Darkness made visible. Chalk dust on vellum. A stair leading downward. Light filtering through a grill. The rain eased outside, leaving only the sound of the clock. I sat again, whiskey in hand, and felt the room tilt slightly, not with drink but with the weight of inference. The case I had been tracing as a line now began to reveal itself as a spiral, drawing me back toward the college's underbelly. I thought of Serena's umbrella left on the bench, of her warning that it was darker inside than I knew. Perhaps she had not been speaking of the library alone. Perhaps she had been telling me, in her careful way, that the poet's altered word was a map. I closed the book. The altered line still glimmered in my mind, a signal from a vanished man. Darkness made visible. Not a misquote, but a key. Behind it, a shadow that was never his. The stair to the cellar was narrow enough for my shoulder to brush the damp wall. Lewis went first, his torch beam shivering over stone like a pale fish underwater. The smell deepened with each step. Mold, cork dust, the faint, metallic tang of wine long gone to vinegar. Above us, the hall murmured with lunchtime voices, but here the air felt sealed, as if no word had been spoken for years. At the bottom, we entered a corridor lined with empty bins and broken chairs. The college's grandeur ended at this threshold. Pipes hissed overhead, carrying steam from kitchens to quadrangles. We moved in silence until the passage widened into the cellar proper, a vault of brick arches, each bay stacked high with crates of port. Dust filmed the bottles in grey velvet. Lewis's torch caught a scatter of chalk on the floor. He crouched, touched it with a fingertip. "Lime wash," he said. I nodded. The same dust had smudged the folio page on my desk. Darkness made visible. Fairfax had chosen his hiding place with a scholar's irony. Or rather, someone had chosen it for him. We wove between the stacks. The air grew colder and sweeter, like breath held too long. My own footsteps echoed off the low ceiling and returned smaller, as though the space itself were swallowing sound. In the farthest arch, the crates rose higher than the others, a wall of wood blocking an alcove. Lewis pushed experimentally. One shifted with a soft grunt. Behind the third row, we found him. Fairfax lay curled on his side, a man not quite at rest. His coat was still buttoned, his shoes polished as though for a lecture. The scarf, the damp wool I had touched in the guest house, lay folded under his head like a makeshift pillow. No blood, no drama. Only a bruise at the temple, the color of spoiled fruit. Lewis exhaled sharply. He asked whether it was an accident. I said accidents seldom fold scarves. The torchlight slid over Fairfax's hand, palm up, fingers slightly bent. A scrap of paper protruded from his pocket. I drew it out. Another note, written in the dean's formal loops, promising funds, requesting silence. A different ink at the bottom, Fairfax's cramped refusal. I felt the cellar tilt, not with vertigo, but with the slow alignment of facts. The dean at evensong, unobserved. The rival scholar coughing in the library to mark his absence. Serena's warning, the bus sighting from a porter's unreliable eyes. Each a piece arranged like the crates before us, blocking view, concealing the thing that mattered. Lewis stood back, rubbing his forehead. He said the dean would deny everything. I told him denial was a form of confession. The scarf had been planted in the room. The bus sighting whispered into an old man's ear. Fairfax's body moved hereafter, or perhaps never moved at all. Pride and panic share a face. I crouched beside Fairfax. His expression was almost calm, as though the last thing he saw had not surprised him. The smell of port rose from the crates, sweet and heavy. On the floor beneath his arm, a faint circle of damp showed where a bottle had stood. I touched it lightly. The label bore the college crest, the dean's initials etched into the wax. From above came a muted clatter of dishes. Life going on. Down here, the silence felt older than the college itself. I looked at the chalk on my fingers, thought of Milton's altered line, of darkness made visible. Fairfax had left me the clue, but the dean had written the ending. Lewis asked if we should call it in. I said yes, but not yet. For a moment, I wanted the cellar to remain unbroken, a place where only inference breathed. The torch beam played over brick and bottle, over a man who had tried to bring light into a dark ledger and been extinguished. We turned back toward the stair. The air grew warmer as we climbed. On the last step I paused, listening to the murmur of the hall above. Laughter, cutlery, a door closing. and thought how easily a college could carry two worlds at once, one of ritual and scholarship, the other of silence and dead. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky over Oxford was the colour of slate, rubbed with chalk. In my pocket, the crossword still lay unfinished, the clue for shadow blank, but no longer meaningless. I wrote the timeline out as though it were a crossword grid, each date a square, each name an intersecting clue. On the table before me, the coded poem lay unfolded like a thin confession. It had been meant, I now realized, not to incriminate Serena, but to draw a curtain across the Dean's own past. Once the acrostics and end letters were read together, the neatness broke. The poem began to speak not of a girl in a cloister, but of a translation, of a grant, of a betrayal buried under scholarship. I traced the years with my pencil. 1983. Fairfax and the rival scholar funded by the Dean's discretionary pot to produce a swift translation of a medieval charter. 1984. The charter discredited, the translation withdrawn, the Dean's signature quietly erased from the journal's acknowledgements. 1985. A fellowship denied to Fairfax, the rival promoted abroad. Decades of silence until Fairfax returned with the coded footnotes and the marginal hints, threatening to make visible what had been concealed. The poem's line about debts of honor had once puzzled me. Now it glowed like chalk in the dark. Not financial debts, but academic ones, the kind that stain reputations more indelibly than embezzlement. The Dean had used college funds to purchase stolen manuscripts, Fairfax had known, and in exposing the fraud would have brought down not just a man, but a mythology of rectitude. Rain slid along the sill of my window. The city beyond was still. Spires turned to silhouettes. In that quiet, I reconstructed the day of the murder as if walking a cloister. Fairfax summoning the Dean to a private meeting in the guest house room. The confrontation? A blow struck more from fear than malice. The panic, the scarf, the cellar, even the false bus sighting was whispered into a porter's credulous ear. Now slotted into the pattern like a black square into a grid. I thought of Serena, how carefully she had bent the corners of pages, how she had held her voice flat even when frightened. She had been drawn into the periphery of the case, but never its heart. The Dean had used her initials in the poem to throw me off. She had accepted suspicion as a kind of penance, perhaps for loving a vanished mentor, perhaps for something I would never know. She came to see me once more before she left. We stood under the dripping eaves outside the library, her suitcase at her feet. She said softly that Oxford was no longer a place she recognized. She thanked me without looking up. I said she owed me nothing. In truth, I had wanted to tell her that she owed herself an escape, but the words stayed behind my teeth. She boarded a taxi and was gone, her umbrella still forgotten on the bench. Back inside, I opened the crossword for the last time. The clue for shadow, which had haunted me through each stage of the case, was now obvious. 6 letters. Umba. Guest. Companion. The one who stands beside. A word that carries both absence and presence. I filled it in with a small satisfaction that felt more like grief. The coded poem lay folded again, its margins marked with my notes. Pride and fear, the twin architects of every tragedy I've ever touched, had led a Dean to murder and a scholar to a cellar. Yet even exposed, the story remained incomplete. Fairfax's body would be buried. The Dean tried. The college cleansed on paper. But the translation would linger, footnoted and retracted, like a ghost in the catalogue. I closed my notebook and looked at the empty chair across from me. Rain ticked like a typewriter against the window. Somewhere a bell tolled the hour with a sound more resigned than solemn. Serena was gone, the Dean unmasked, and Oxford, that city of shadows and margins, continued to stand. Dusk had already thinned to a kind of bruised silver when I reached the bridge. The stones underfoot were slick with evening moisture, their edges worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. I leaned on the cold railing as I had weeks earlier, though now the case lay behind me like a closed folio. Closed, but not resolved. The river moved sluggishly beneath, a pane of tarnished glass, reflecting nothing except a blurred crescent of sky. In the hush, I could still conjure the smell of port and chalk from the cellar, Serena's umbrella left on the bench, the dean's neat loops in the coded poem. Pride and fear had taken their shapes, but the shapes had not given me peace. In my pocket, the crossword lay folded. The clue for shadow, 6 letters, had remained empty all through the investigation, a small square of resistance amid larger puzzles. Umbra. I'd written it at last on the morning of the dean's confession, but the ink looked foreign, as if someone else had solved it for me. Guest, companion, double. The word now seemed less an answer than a postscript. The bells of Christchurch tolled, each note reaching across the mist like a hand groping for another. Somewhere a bicycle's bell answered faintly, then was gone. I watched the water darken, thinking of Milton's line. Darkness visible, not an image now, but a method, the poet's paradox as Fairfax's clue, the dean's undoing, my own slow recognition. How easily shadows deceive. How willingly one reads them as evidence. How often they are only absence arranged to resemble form. Across the quad, a window flared suddenly with light. For a heartbeat it framed a silhouette. Perhaps a porter, perhaps a student bent over notes. Then the lamp went out. The square of brightness closed like an eye. In that instant, I remembered Serena's face when she said she feared for someone else, the way her fingers trembled at the page's corner, her careful withdrawal from a city she no longer recognized. Some departures are neither escape nor exile, but a quiet refusal to be part of another footnote. Mist rose from the river and drifted over the parapet, brushing my sleeve. The smell of wet wool lingered there still, a ghost of the scarf from the guest house, a reminder that no case, however neatly written, ends without residue. I thought of Lewis, of his straightforward certainty, of his relief at the dean's arrest. I envied him that clarity. I traced a finger along the railing, feeling the cold bite of iron. The crossword crinkled in my pocket like a secret letter. For a moment I considered tearing it up, letting the squares dissolve into the water below. Instead I kept it, folded and unresolved, despite its filled-in answer. The bells fell silent. A gull's cry lifted over the rooftops, brief and harsh. The bridge, the river, the colleges around me felt both eternal and precarious, a city balanced on its own shadows. I turned at last toward the high street. Behind me, the mist closed in, softening the outlines of stone and spire. Each step carried the faint echo of another, as if someone walked just beside me but a fraction behind. Umbra, guest, companion. The clue solved but not finished, the case concluded but not complete.